In the remote hills of East Texas, where pine forests blend with endless plains, a series of camps once promised salvation to the damned. Between 1845 and 1881, over 300 souls entered these camps seeking forgiveness for their sins, but only a handful ever left alive. The survivors spoke in whispers about purification rituals so extreme that death seemed merciful in comparison. When federal investigators finally breached these camps in 1881, they uncovered something far more horrifying than religious fanaticism. A secret cemetery containing nearly 200 victims, each bearing signs of prolonged torture. But it was what they found in the Damnation Family's private ledgers that shook the very foundations of frontier justice, revealing a criminal operation so elaborate that it had gone undetected for over 3 decades. Tonight, we unveil the complete story of the most successful serial killers in American frontier history, and the twisted salvation they offered to the desperate and damned. Before we continue with the story of the Damnation Family and their reign of terror disguised as salvation, let me ask you something. This channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to face the darkest chapters of American history. If you're one of the few who can handle stories like this, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. The truth we're about to uncover will challenge everything you thought you knew about faith, justice, and the price of redemption on the American frontier. The year was 1845, and Texas had just joined the Union as the 28th state after nearly a decade as an independent republic. The frontier was a vast, lawless land where desperate men and women fled from their pasts, seeking either redemption or ruin in equal measure. It was a place where a man's word was his bond, where justice often came at the end of a rope, and where religious fervor burned as hot as the summer's sun. Along the dusty trails that connected sparse settlements, word spread of 3 brothers who promised something precious to the damned immediate salvation through purification of the flesh. Please give me a like and subscribe so I can be motivated to create more great videos. The Damnation Family preacher, Malachi evangelist Cornelius, and prophet Jebediah had arrived in Texas from Arkansas in early 1845. Carrying letters of recommendation from various Baptist and Methodist congregations throughout the South. Preacher Malachi Damnation stood 6 feet tall with piercing gray eyes that seemed to look straight into a man's soul. His black hair was always perfectly groomed, and his voice possessed an almost otherworldly quality that could make hardened killers weep like children. At 35, he was the eldest and most charismatic of the 3 brothers, capable of delivering sermons that left audiences both terrified and exhilarated. Evangelist Cornelius, 2 years Malachi's junior, had an uncanny ability to read the guilt written on a person's face. He could identify a man's specific sins with such accuracy that many believed he had supernatural powers. His thin frame and hollow cheeks only added to his reputation for spiritual insight. Cornelius specialized in what the brothers called confession extraction, getting sinners to reveal their darkest secrets. The youngest brother, prophet Jebediah, claimed to receive visions directly from the Almighty. At 28, he was built like a blacksmith, with massive hands that he said were blessed with healing powers. His role was to oversee the physical aspects of purification, ensuring each penitent received the exact level of suffering their sins demanded. Together, they established a network of redemption camps along the most desolate stretches of East Texas, where the cypress swamps met the piney woods and civilization felt like a distant memory. From the outside, the camps appeared modest canvas tents arranged in perfect circles around rough wooden crosses with a central fire pit where the brothers would preach to gatherings of desperate souls. The clientele was exactly what one might expect on the frontier: cowboys fleeing rustling charges, prostitutes seeking escape from brutal brothel owners, gamblers drowning in insurmountable debt, murderers on the run from vigilantes, and deserters from both the Mexican War and various Indian conflicts. But the camps also attracted a surprising number of seemingly respectable citizens, merchants, guilty of fraud, politicians fleeing corruption scandals, and even some legitimate seekers of spiritual guidance who had heard of the brothers' reputation for miraculous transformations. The Damnation brothers preached a harsh gospel of immediate purification that resonated with the violent, unforgiving nature of frontier life. Sin must be burned away like chaff in the fire. Malachi would thunder, his voice echoing through the pines as flames danced across his angular face. The flesh must suffer so the spirit can soar to eternal glory. There are no shortcuts to salvation, only the narrow path of pain that leads to paradise. Their reputation for producing miraculous transformations spread throughout Texas and neighboring states. According to testimonials that appeared regularly in frontier newspapers, men entered the camps as hardened sinners and emerged as new creations, gentle as lambs, pure as mountain snow, ready to spread the gospel to the furthest corners of the earth. It was on a sweltering August night in 1847 that the first disturbing reports began to surface, though few paid attention at the time. A cattle driver named Samuel Hartwell stumbled into the town of Marshall, Texas, barely alive, and speaking in terrified whispers about what he had witnessed at a redemption camp near Caddo Lake. Hartwell's appearance was shocking. He had once been a robust man in his 30s, but now he was gaunt and prematurely aged, his hair completely white and his hands shook uncontrollably. Most disturbing of all were his eyes. Once bright blue, they now held a hollow, haunted quality, suggesting he had seen things no man should witness. His story was fragmented, told in fits of trembling and moments of catatonic silence. According to Hartwell, he had entered the camp seeking forgiveness for killing a man in a saloon fight over a disputed card game. They said the pain would cleanse my soul, he whispered to Pastor William Matthews, his voice barely audible. Brother Malachi looked into my eyes and told me exactly what I had done. Not just the killing, but things I'd never told another living soul. He knew about the money I'd stolen from my mother before leaving Arkansas. He knew about the woman I'd left pregnant in New Orleans. He knew everything. The purification process began immediately upon arrival at the camp. Penitents were stripped of all possessions, including their clothes, and given rough burlap robes. They were then required to confess not only the sin that had brought them to the camp, but every transgression they had ever committed, no matter how minor. Brother Cornelius would sit across from them with a ledger writing down everything they said. If he suspected they were holding something back, Brother Jebediah would use his gifts to help them remember using his massive hands to cause pain beyond imagination. The confession process could take days or even weeks, depending on the perceived honesty of the penitent. Only when the brothers were satisfied that every sin had been revealed would the physical purification begin. This started with a complete fast, 7 days, with nothing but water, during which the penitent was forced to dig their own grave as a symbol of their spiritual death. The hunger was nothing compared to what came next, the trial of fire. Beatings with leather whips that had metal fragments sewn into them. Each lash was supposed to represent a specific sin being scourged from the flesh. But it went on for hours, sometimes days. The physical torture was only the beginning. Hartwell described ritualistic burials where penitents were placed in the graves they had dug and covered with dirt, leaving only their faces exposed. They would remain buried for varying lengths of time, sometimes minutes, sometimes hours, while the brothers prayed over them and declared their spiritual death complete. Some of them never came back up. Brother Malachi would stand over the graves and declare them perfectly purified, saying they had been called home to glory. But Hartwell saw the terror in their faces as they went under. There was no peace, only absolute fear. The most horrifying part of Hartwell's account was his description of those who didn't survive the purification process. According to him, the brothers maintained that death during purification was the ultimate blessing proof that the individual had achieved such complete spiritual cleansing that God had called them directly to paradise. When someone died, the brothers would plant a wooden cross and add the person's name to what they called the roll of the redeemed. They claimed these souls had skipped purgatory entirely. Local authorities in Marshall initially dismissed Hartwell's story as the ravings of a man broken by guilt and frontier madness. After all, no one had reported missing persons. And the Damnation brothers had impeccable credentials. But the disappearance of Hartwell and the lack of evidence didn't stop the camps from operating. Their reputation for miraculous conversions continued to grow. The letters suggested that Thomas had found salvation, but something about the handwriting unsettled me. It looked like his writing, but there were subtle differences, the way certain letters were formed, the phrases used. I began to suspect that someone was copying his style. When Mrs. Westbrook hired a private investigator to locate her son in California, the results were deeply troubling. None of the churches or missions in the areas Thomas claimed to be working had any record of him. The addresses he provided in his letters were either non-existent or occupied by people who had never heard of Thomas Westbrook or his missionary work. Similar stories began to emerge across the region. Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, a traveling physician who had treated several survivors of the camps, began to notice a disturbing pattern in their symptoms. They exhibited signs of severe trauma. She would later testify before a federal tribunal, not witnessing the peaceful countenance of the spiritually redeemed, but the hollow stare of those who had witnessed unspeakable horrors. The few survivors who did return to civilization were indeed changed, but not in the way the brothers claimed. They spoke little, jumped at sudden noises, and seemed to carry a burden of knowledge too terrible to share. Most disturbing was their universal reluctance to discuss their time at the camps as if bound by some unholy oath of silence. Dr. Thornton documented several cases that particularly troubled her. Jacob Miller, a former outlaw who had survived the purification process, displayed symptoms she had only seen in soldiers who had witnessed the worst atrocities of war. He would wake screaming about the pit and the ceremony of ascension. She noted in her journal that when pressed for details, he would only say, "Some forms of salvation come at too high a price." Another survivor, a woman named Sarah Colby, had sought redemption after abandoning her children to pursue a life of prostitution. She returned to her family a broken shell of her former self. She would spend hours staring at nothing, and her sister Mary reported that sometimes she would whisper prayers, but they weren't normal prayers. She would ask God to forgive her for the things she had seen, not the things she had done. Perhaps most telling was the case of Reverend Peter Hawkins, a Methodist minister who had volunteered to observe the Damnation brothers' methods with an eye toward incorporating their techniques into his own ministry. Hawkins had entered the camp as a spiritual mentor and observer, not as a penitent. Yet he emerged just as traumatized as any other survivor. There are forms of evil that masquerade as righteousness, Hawkins told Dr. Thornton during one of their sessions. I went seeking inspiration for my ministry and found something that shook my faith to its core. The brothers are not servants of God. They are something else entirely, something that uses our deepest spiritual needs as weapons against us. When pressed for specifics, Hawkins would only say that the true purpose of the camps had nothing to do with salvation, but everything to do with the exploitation of the most vulnerable members of society. He refused to elaborate, claiming that speaking the truth would only endanger others who might be tempted to investigate. The pattern of mysterious disappearances and traumatized survivors continued throughout the 1850s and into the 1860s. But the chaos of the Civil War provided perfect cover for the Damnation brothers' activities. With entire populations displaced and communication systems disrupted, it became even easier for people to vanish without explanation. However, the end of the war brought new challenges for the brothers and new opportunities for those seeking to expose their crimes. In the spring of 1879, nearly 15 years after the conflict's end, a young Texas Ranger named Captain James Morrison began investigating reports of missing persons throughout East Texas. Morrison was a methodical man with a background in military intelligence, and he noticed something that others had missed: a pattern of disappearances that seemed to follow the movement of the redemption camps like a shadow across the frontier. Morrison had been assigned to the case after receiving a formal complaint from Senator Charles Whitman of Louisiana, whose nephew had disappeared after entering a damnation camp near the Texas border. Unlike previous investigations, which had been conducted by local sheriffs with limited resources and jurisdiction, Morrison had the authority and funding to conduct a comprehensive multi-state investigation. "There's something here that doesn't add up," Morrison wrote in his initial report to Ranger headquarters in Austin. "I've documented over 60 missing persons cases in the past 3 years alone, all connected to these redemption camps. That's not counting the cases from earlier years or other states where records are incomplete." Morrison's investigation led him to interview dozens of families who had lost contact with relatives after they entered the camps. The stories were remarkably similar. Loved ones would seek redemption at a damnation camp. Correspondence would continue for several weeks, describing their spiritual transformation, then abruptly cease with a final letter explaining their calling to missionary work in remote locations. The ranger's suspicions deepened when he attempted to verify these missionary claims. Letters sent to the addresses provided were invariably returned as undeliverable. Churches and missions in the territories where the converts had allegedly gone to serve had no record of their arrival. Most damning was Morrison's discovery that several of the testimonial letters, supposedly written by grateful families, contained identical phrases and even identical grammatical errors. "Someone is manufacturing these testimonials," Morrison concluded in a confidential memo to his superior. "The question is whether we're dealing with fraud, kidnapping, or something worse." Morrison's breakthrough came when he encountered a man named Tobias Fletcher in a tavern in Jefferson, Texas. Fletcher was drunk and rambling, but his story was coherent enough to send chills down Morrison's spine. Fletcher claimed to have worked as a grave digger and general laborer for the Damnation brothers for nearly 2 years in the mid-1870s. "I thought I was helping with the Lord's work," Fletcher whispered, his hands shaking as he reached for his bottle. "Brother Malachi told me I was blessed to assist in the purification of souls. But some of those graves weren't for show. Some stayed filled permanent. He said that the brothers would pray over them and declare another soul saved for eternity. But Fletcher knew what was really buried down there." According to Fletcher, his duties included not only digging the symbolic graves used in purification rituals, but also disposing of the bodies of those who ascended during purification. The brothers maintained that these individuals had achieved such complete spiritual cleansing that God had called them directly to paradise. But Fletcher had seen enough bodies to know the difference between natural death and murder, the way Brother Jebediah would work with his hands. Fletcher continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He claimed it was healing, but I saw what those hands could do. He could make a man suffer for days without killing him, drawing out every bit of information about family money property. Then, when they had everything they needed, he'd finish the job." Fletcher described a sophisticated operation that went far beyond simple murder. The brothers would extract detailed information about their victims' assets, family connections, and business dealings during prolonged torture sessions. They would then use this information to forge correspondence with family members, often requesting money for fictional missionary work, while providing plausible explanations for why the missionary couldn't return home or meet in person. The money kept coming, Fletcher revealed. Families would send funds to support their loved ones' work, spreading the gospel, and the brothers had set up multiple intermediaries to ensure that the money couldn't be traced back to them. Some families continued sending money for years, never knowing that their sons and daughters were dead and buried in unmarked graves. When Morrison pressed Fletcher for details about the location of these graves, the man's demeanor changed completely. Terror replaced drunken bravado, and he began looking around the room as if afraid someone might be listening. Rangers wounded. The Damnation brothers had anticipated the threat and were prepared to defend their operation at any cost. As the Rangers engaged in the gunfight, it became painfully clear that this wasn't just a religious front, it was a full-scale criminal enterprise fiercely protected by armed accomplices. The brothers fought with a cold, methodical precision that suggested years of preparation. They knew the terrain and had set traps to delay or deter any intrusion. Captain Morrison's team fought valiantly, but it quickly became apparent that the odds were stacked against them. The Damnation brothers had fortified their camp with a network of armed men hidden throughout the surrounding woods, each with orders to protect the camp and its secrets at all costs. Despite the danger, Morrison and his Rangers pushed forward, determined to end the brothers' reign of terror. The gunfight raged for nearly an hour, with the brothers using their knowledge of the land and the terrain to gain the upper hand. Eventually, Morrison's team managed to corner the brothers in the central tent, but it came at a heavy cost. 2 Rangers were seriously injured, and several of the brothers' accomplices were killed in the exchange. The brothers themselves, though, fought with such ferocity that it took every last ounce of strength the Rangers had to subdue them. In the end, Malachi, Cornelius, and Jebediah were captured and taken into custody, their dreams of maintaining their operation shattered. As the Rangers began to process the crime scene, they found a wealth of evidence that revealed the true scale of the brothers' operation. The ledgers hidden among the camp's ritualistic accoutrements detailed not just the names and financial backgrounds of the victims, but also the systematic nature of their criminal empire. It became clear that this was not merely a case of serial murder. It was a vast, multi-state operation involving fraud, kidnapping, and even counterfeiting. The brothers had managed to disguise their illegal activities under the guise of religious salvation, using the vulnerable and desperate as pawns in their criminal schemes. The brothers were eventually brought to trial, where the full extent of their crimes came to light. Their network spanned across several states, and their victims numbered in the hundreds. The trial revealed the depth of their manipulation, with families unknowingly sending money to support fictional missionary work for years after their loved ones had perished. The Damnation brothers were convicted on multiple charges, including murder, fraud, and kidnapping, and sentenced to life imprisonment. Captain Morrison's investigation was hailed as one of the most significant in frontier history. It exposed not only a group of brutal serial killers, but also an elaborate criminal enterprise that had operated undetected for decades. The exposure of the Damnation brothers marked the end of their reign of terror, but it also served as a chilling reminder of how easily faith can be manipulated to serve evil purposes. Their story became a dark chapter in the history of the American frontier, one that would haunt the survivors and victims' families for generations to come. Despite the brothers' capture, the damage they had caused lingered long after their imprisonment. Many families were left broken, their loved ones lost to an operation built on lies, torture, and exploitation. Even as the brothers were put behind bars, the memories of those who had suffered at their hands continued to echo through the woods near Caddo Lake, a stark reminder of the darkness that can hide behind the mask of salvation. Letters from the families of victims that painted a much darker picture. As the evidence mounted, the prosecution's case grew more irrefutable, and the defense's portrayal of the brothers as well-meaning but misguided religious zealots began to fall apart. The survivors who took the stand spoke in haunting detail about the torture they had endured, and the letters from families revealed a chilling pattern of deception that extended far beyond spiritual zealotry. One by one, former victims took the stand, each recounting their experiences in the damnation camps. Their testimonies described not only physical suffering, but psychological manipulation so severe that many had been made to believe they were beyond redemption and that their suffering was part of a divine plan. For some, their time in the camp had so warped their perception of reality that they still believed, even after their release, that they were part of a higher purpose. The prosecution also presented the records found in the camp, which laid bare the brothers' meticulous planning and cold calculated actions. The ledgers didn't just account for victims, They included detailed notes on financial transactions, evidence of forged documents, and meticulously tracked schemes to extract money from grieving families. Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, who had worked with survivors and analyzed the physical evidence, testified about the brothers' advanced knowledge of human anatomy and psychology. She explained how they had used this knowledge to maximize suffering, keeping victims alive as long as possible while extracting the information they needed. The forensic evidence revealed that the brothers had not only engaged in serial killings, but had also experimented with their torture methods, refining them over time to ensure maximum effectiveness. The public's outrage only intensified as the trial progressed. Witnesses from all over the South testified about loved ones who had disappeared after entering the brothers' camps. Families who had sent money to support what they believed were missionary endeavors learned that their loved ones had been murdered, their letters forged, and their final requests manipulated. The evidence painted a picture of a criminal enterprise that had not only preyed on the vulnerable, but had used religion as a cover for their atrocities, manipulating people's deepest fears and spiritual needs for their own gain. The courtroom was filled with the families of victims, many of whom had traveled great distances to witness the trial. The emotional weight of the proceedings was felt by everyone present. The victims' families, many of whom had been deceived for years, could hardly believe the truth about what had happened to their loved ones. It wasn't just the financial losses that haunted them, but the devastating realization that their family members had died in a system designed to exploit and break them. The brothers had taken lives, shattered families, and left behind a trail of psychological devastation that would last for generations. Despite their defense team's efforts to portray them as well-meaning but misguided, the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges. The Damnation brothers were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict was met with a mix of relief and sorrow. For the families of the victims, justice had been served, but the damage done by the brothers' actions would never be fully repaired. The trial of the Damnation brothers became one of the most sensational criminal proceedings in Texas history. The case not only revealed the depths of the brothers' cruelty, but also highlighted the vulnerability of frontier communities where law enforcement was often stretched thin, and the isolated nature of settlements made it difficult to track criminal activities. The brothers' ability to manipulate and control entire communities through fear, deception, and psychological conditioning was a stark reminder of how easily people can be preyed upon, especially when they are at their most vulnerable. As the brothers were led away to prison, the towns and families they had terrorized began the slow process of rebuilding. The horrific events surrounding the redemption camps would never be forgotten, and the scars left by the brothers' actions would endure for many years. The story of the Damnation brothers would become a dark chapter in American frontier history, a reminder of the capacity for evil that can hide behind a mask of religion and righteousness. That they made him an integral part of their criminal enterprise. The shocking discovery of Grimm's true identity cast an even darker shadow over the brothers' operations, further unraveling the carefully constructed facade they had built over the years. As prosecutor Maxwell laid out the details of their criminal past, it became clear that the brothers' religious persona was nothing more than a well-executed cover for their brutal, calculated scheme to exploit the vulnerable. The defense, already on shaky ground, found itself completely undermined by the damning testimony. Despite their attempts to paint the brothers as misguided religious zealots, the overwhelming evidence combined with the brothers' own chilling admissions left little room for doubt. The brothers had not been driven by a desire to save souls, but by a cold, business-like approach to exploitation, murder, and fraud. Malachi's proud description of their operation as a service for society, Cornelius's methodical approach to confession extraction, and Jebediah's clinical dissection of his torture techniques all painted a picture of men who were not only dangerous, but deeply detached from any semblance of moral or ethical reasoning. The survivors' testimonies also carried great weight. particularly Samuel Hartwell's recounting of his own torment and the brothers' sadistic enjoyment of his suffering. Hartwell's description of how the brothers used psychological manipulation to turn victims into willing participants in their own torment was especially harrowing. Rebecca Marsh and Jacob Wheeler's testimonies further corroborated the claims of systematic psychological and physical abuse, revealing the deep psychological scars that had been left on those who survived. In the end, the evidence against the brothers was undeniable. Their detailed financial records, meticulous documentation of victims, and the discovery of their true identities, along with the horrifying accounts from survivors and accomplices, left the jury with no choice but to convict. The brothers were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Though some speculated that their capture and subsequent trial had been the result of years of careful planning by law enforcement to take down such a dangerous criminal syndicate. The trial of the Damnation brothers marked the end of a dark chapter in American frontier history, but the damage they caused would resonate for years. Victims' families who had been deceived by the brothers were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, knowing that their loved ones had died in the hands of men who had exploited their faith for personal gain. The brothers' conviction also served as a warning how easily trust and belief can be twisted by those with evil intentions. In the aftermath of the trial, the communities across the South slowly began to heal, but the legacy of the Damnation brothers remained. The question lingered, how had these men disguised as religious leaders managed to prey on the most vulnerable people for so long undetected? The answer, as uncovered during the investigation, was chilling. Their combination of religious fervor, psychological manipulation, and criminal sophistication had allowed them to operate in plain sight, hiding behind the guise of salvation, while committing some of the most heinous crimes ever witnessed on the American frontier. Criminal investigations and his success in bringing the Damnation brothers to justice set a precedent for law enforcement in frontier regions. Under Morrison's leadership, the task force focused on tracking and dismantling similar criminal syndicates that preyed on vulnerable populations across the South and West. His meticulous cross-jurisdictional approach became a cornerstone of modern investigative practices, and the principles he laid out would later be used to build frameworks for tackling organized crime in the rapidly expanding United States. The public outcry from the Damnation case sparked widespread reforms. New laws were introduced requiring religious organizations, particularly those operating in isolated regions, to be registered and regularly monitored. The case also led to stricter regulations on itinerant preachers, ensuring they could not easily exploit vulnerable communities without scrutiny. Many of the frontier's more remote communities began to establish better communication systems and stronger ties to law enforcement, making it harder for predators like the Damnation brothers to operate unnoticed. Meanwhile, the psychological and social impact of the case was felt deeply throughout the affected communities. Families that had been deceived by the brothers were left to pick up the shattered remnants of their lives, some never fully recovering from the emotional toll. Entire towns that had contributed funds to what they believed was a noble cause found themselves devastated, realizing that their generosity had unknowingly funded a criminal enterprise built on lies, torture, and death. The damage was not only financial, but deeply psychological, as many struggled to reconcile the belief in a higher purpose they had supported with the monstrous reality that had been exposed. Dr. Elizabeth Thornton's research on the psychology of the Damnation brothers and their victims became a crucial part of the growing field of criminal psychology. Her study, The Anatomy of Evil, which analyzed the methods used by systematic killers to identify and exploit vulnerable individuals, became one of the first texts to formally recognize the importance of understanding criminal behavior on a psychological level. Her work laid the foundation for modern criminal profiling, helping investigators identify patterns in criminal activity that were previously invisible to the law enforcement community. It also led to the creation of victim advocacy programs designed to provide support and resources to those affected by such heinous crimes. In the years following the convictions, The legacy of the Damnation brothers continued to shape both law enforcement and social attitudes towards crime. Their case was studied in law schools and criminal psychology programs as a defining example of organized crime exploitation and the devastating consequences of unchecked religious extremism. The chilling reality of their operations forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about the ease with which vulnerable people can be preyed upon, and the lengths to which criminals will go to exploit those in need of hope. The brothers' execution and the subsequent reforms that followed marked the end of a dark chapter in American frontier history. But their story would remain a stark reminder of the dangers of manipulation and the fragility of trust. The final words of Walter Grimm haunted many as they echoed the disturbing truth. There are others like us out there. We were not unique. We were simply more successful than most. This chilling warning served as a reminder that the frontier, in all its lawlessness and isolation, could breed predators who knew how to exploit the desperation and despair of those seeking redemption. And though the Damnation brothers were gone, their influence continued to cast a shadow over the frontier, long after their death. Criminal investigations throughout the American West continued to uncover the dark legacies left behind by those like the Damnation brothers. The sites of their camps, once havens for exploitation and horror, remain largely abandoned, with locals avoiding the areas fearing that the very ground had been cursed by the atrocities committed there. Even more than a century later, there are whispered tales among the few who still live in the remote parts of East Texas where the brothers once roamed. The stories speak of strange occurrences, lights seen in the distance, voices carried on the wind, and a feeling of being watched, as if the spirits of those who sought salvation now haunt the land, unable to find peace. The story of the Damnation family forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the potential for evil that exists even within seemingly civilized society. The brothers' crimes were made possible not only by their own depravity, but by a social system that failed to protect its most vulnerable members. They succeeded for so long because they understood how to exploit the very gaps in frontier society. Poor communication between jurisdictions, the reluctance to investigate the disappearance of social outcasts, and the general assumption that religious activities were inherently benevolent. The brothers turned society's best impulses, faith, hope, and the desire for redemption into weapons against the very people who most needed protection. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that the Damnation brothers were not aberrations or anomalies. They were products of a system that created ideal conditions for their type of predatory behavior. The frontier, with its combination of isolation, desperation, and weak law enforcement, created opportunities that were inevitably exploited by those willing to embrace absolute evil. Their story serves as a permanent reminder that evil often wears the mask of righteousness, and that the most dangerous predators are those who exploit our deepest spiritual and emotional needs. In a world where people seek meaning, purpose, and redemption, there will always be those ready to offer false salvation at the ultimate price. The Damnation family claimed to offer salvation to the damned, but in the end, they proved that some forms of damnation are far worse than any sin their victims had ever committed. Their legacy is written in unmarked graves scattered across the American frontier, a testament to the depths of human evil and the cost of misplaced trust. What do you think about this dark chapter of American frontier history? Do you believe such systematic evil could exist in our modern world? Or were the Damnation brothers merely products of their unique time and place? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story as chilling as thousands of others have, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, because the American frontier holds many more dark secrets waiting to be uncovered. Share this video with someone who appreciates the shadows of history, and remember, sometimes the greatest evil comes disguised as salvation. Until next time, stay vigilant against those who would exploit faith for their own twisted purposes. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.